As I said at the end of the last video, I'm quite happy with the way our skin material and face overall is progressing. I'm not sure it's quite perfect yet, but it's headed in the right direction. So I want to take a break and focus on the hoodie and the glasses, beginning with the hoodie material. So we can hide the head. We'll just uncheck that collection for now, and I want to re-enable our clothing collection in the viewport and at render time. And we were in local view, so we will leave local view. And I guess I can still hide the glasses until we're done with the hoodie. And Control B, draw a box render region around the hoodie. And if you think back, remember during the simulation of the hoodie, we laid out the UVs before we simulated it into its final shape. And this is where that pays off, because if we select the hoodie, tab into edit mode, and change this to the UV image editor, sorry, it's just UV editor now, old habit, and we can remove the render result, select everything in edit mode, and now we can see our UVs as they've been updated throughout the finalization of the model. And it looks like it's completely clean. If we zoom in, oh, I spoke too soon. All right, there's one little issue here. I'm not sure what's happening. Just some random verts. I really should fix those. Looks like in the corners, there's a slight bit of randomness here and there, but these really won't bother me much. But this is pretty bad. So how can I fix this? It looks to me like some of the verts have been separated when they could be merged together to fill in these gaps. So I know we can see that relationship if I turn on UV sync selection. All right, so this means if I minimize whatever I select in the UV editor, that will also be selected in the mesh. Ah, look at that. So in the armpit area, the mesh gets a little bit wonky. Not really a big deal because it's completely covered, but clearly it caused some issues in the UV layout. But if I switch to vertex mode in the UV editor, we should be able to click on these verts and find the corresponding vert. In other words, these two should be merged. And so if I hit the M key, we get our merge menu. Unfortunately, we don't get the at first or at last option, which would be preferable. But we do have at cursor, and so I can use that. If I kind of move this down, this pattern of the three holding edge verts side by side, I know that's going to be the shape here. And so I can merge this one, shift right click the cursor to about that same spot, merge at cursor, and we get the same behavior effectively. M at cursor. And then we'll set up the three verts, holding edges, and merge again by cursor. So that section's cleaned up. What about this one? Should basically be the same process. Some of these do not have corresponding positions. So I'll save those for last. And then as I move them into place, it should be fairly clear where they go. The closer we get, the more evident it becomes. Okay, so now I get an idea for the mesh structure. It's probably not perfect, but it's going to work much better than it was previously. So that was a small hiccup in the process, but still, it was very smart to lay out UVs when we did, so we can quickly get into developing our material. Now, something I want to keep in mind is consistency of orientation between these patches, because we're going to be adding a procedural weave pattern, and we don't want that to be pointed horizontally for some mesh islands and vertically for others. So basically this means I need to, first turn off our sync selection tool and then select everything in edit mode. And now I can select UV islands without selecting the corresponding verts. And so basically what I want to do is take each patch and rotate it vertically. All right, so this is the arm patch where it connects to the shoulder up top and the wrist at the bottom. And we'll do that to each one. All right, so this is the back patch. We want the head to be vertical. We'll make it -90. And then the hood patches can remain like this, both being vertically oriented. Maybe rotate this on 180 degrees. And we've got this. Let's see, what is this exactly? I want to say it's the rim around the hood. Like the border of this thing right here. Let's take a look. If we select our edges, okay, maybe not. All right, what if we grow, Control plus? Okay, so this is a problem. I've got it separated in ways I don't want it to be separated. See if I can figure this out. Okay, this whole section needs to be laid out on its own. So I'll hit U unwrap. And I need to set a seam. Let's hit Shift H to hide everything else. Go to Edge Selection. We'll make sure that this splits down the middle. Control E, mark seam. And then A, U, unwrap. Okay, I missed a seam somewhere. Okay, Control E, mark seam. Geometry gets a little bit bad there, but I'm hoping we can get away with that. U unwrap. I want this to lay out fairly vertical. I'm still missing a seam. I'm just trying to cut this all the way off. Okay, there we go. Finally, it's laying out vertically. It gets pretty bad up there. Let's try the relax brush. Just try and sculpt these out to be a little bit cleaner. Okay, I think that'll work out fine. But now that we've laid out this new island, I'm pretty sure they won't be scaled consistently. So let's unhide everything else, select all our mesh components, and then in the UV editor, select everything, UV, and average island scale, UV, pack islands. But in those options, make sure to disable rotation because we're rotating manually in the orientation that we want. And so as far as like evenly packing these islands or maximizing the textile density, I'm not so concerned about that. We're not going to be creating texture files, but we will be using the texture coordinates. And so if it bothers you, you can put like 0.05 in the margin just to try and pack them a little bit tighter. But again, this really doesn't matter. But I need to go back to fixing the orientations. And it might help for selection consistency, like if I want to select based on the 3D model. You know, if I hit L, in theory, I should be able to select by the seam, right? Because we cut seams and laid out UVs where the model is stitched together. But throughout the process, we lost explicit UV seams, even though our islands are explicitly separated. It's kind of a weird thing that happens. But if we want to recover that data, we can go to the UV menu and choose seams from islands. And this should generate them properly. So now I can hit L and select linked by seam. And now I can see what that patch is. So this needs to be rotated 90 degrees. All right, so this is the neck hole. We'll do the next patch. Rotate this 90 degrees, or yeah, 90, perfect. And then this bottom patch. All right, that needs to be rotated 90 as well. Although which side is up will enable selection masking. Selection syncing. Okay, so the top is the bottom in the 3D view. So we'll turn that off and rotate 180. And then I think that's it. I think we got everything else correctly. Okay, so we'll just run that UV pack island command one more time. And now our UVs should be perfectly set up to begin developing our material. So we'll tab back to object mode, hit the new material button, and we'll call this hoodie. Now, this whole material starts with a procedural weave pattern. And I'm going to cheat. The first time I've cheated in this course, I'm pretty sure. Because I'm going to provide a convenient node group that contains all the weave pattern nodes. And yes, this does hurt my pride, but let me explain. First, let's append the node group into this scene. We can go to File, Append, and you want to look for a textile weave a.blend file. Double click on that, and then go to our node tree and grab the CGC textile weave a ng or node group. All right, so we've appended that, and we don't have access to it until we hit the Shift A group and select that node group. All right, now it's present in the material. And please allow me to explain, or rather confess, why I'm not going to teach how to make this. If we tab into that node group, maximize this, you'll see a huge collection of nodes, bigger than any material we've created so far. And this is only the weave pattern. But the confession part is, I don't understand the math that's going on here. Even though I built this myself, I was only able to do it by piecing together information from Simon Tom's course on the Blender Cloud. And even though I've watched that course multiple times, I just don't understand all the math involved in those crazy complex procedural materials that are so popular during November. And so I'm simply not equipped to explain this in a way that's understandable because I don't even understand it. So forgive me for that, but also take heart in the fact that everyone is on a journey. This is the next step in my journey, trying to understand how to do all this math. But for now, I'm just at a place of being able to mimic other tutorials and piece together these complex materials. So again, I'm sorry for not teaching this node by node, but that would take forever for one, and I don't yet understand it. So what we're left with instead is a convenient node group, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. If we switch to rendered view and then Shift-Control click on the node group, let's zoom way in because this pattern is very small. All right, so this is the type of weave pattern that this node group generates. And as we orbit the viewport, it's kind of hard to look at with the cycles renderer. So it might actually be better if we switch to the material preview. It might take a bit to load the shader, or no, not at all apparently. But this way we can adjust the settings and see it much faster. All right, so let's overview what settings we have here. First of all is the scale, which it should be close to real world because our hoodie is real world scale and a scale of 1 here fits. But if you want to increase the size of the pattern, just take this value lower. If you want to make it even smaller, go above 1. But if you're building to real world scale, 1 should be a believable value. Next is this horizontal, if we bring out the width, horizontal squash setting, which I use to make the vertical columns in the weave tighter or wider. All right, so this makes them tighter. The higher we go, the lower we go, it'll stretch it out. But I think 1.5 is the default value. And again, this node group is kind of built for this model, so the default values are going to work. And then we've got thread color random. All right, if we turn that to 0, this is just the weave pattern with no randomization, which often is realistic to add a little bit of randomization, especially with the type of hoodie that we are going to be creating, which by the way, I don't even have the reference opened. Is that loaded in yet? It is. All right, so let's kind of find a good hoodie example, something big. They all have a weave pattern. As we zoom in, you can see evidence of that. But the random color does change depending on the type of hoodie. This white hoodie doesn't have much of a random, if any at all. Whereas this one here, to me, is kind of a stereotypical classic gray hoodie. And this definitely has the randomization in the threads. So playing with that is a good value to have access to. And then thread thickness, as we adjust this, the lower we go, the threads kind of expand outward. And the higher we go, they tend to get thinner. So that's just a few settings. This is nothing like a completely comprehensive weave node group. I think there's potential to use it for several different types of fabric, but it is generated directly from my rehearsals of this portrait. And so it's robust enough, but certainly convenient that we don't have to build this from scratch. So that's available to you. I recommend you use it, especially if you're trying to follow these lessons. And another thing I should say is this, if we tab into node group view mode, it's kind of like node group edit mode. We are using UV coordinates, so it only works with that. It expects it. And since we oriented our UVs vertically, the weave pattern works out beautifully. And so we get this natural, very realistic pattern separation in the seams, which is where that would happen anyway. And this is a great way to get very high frequency detail, which would be extremely difficult to paint in a texture format. So doing it procedurally makes a lot of sense. And then combined with the way you lay the UVs out, it ends up working really well. And like even some stretching, it kind of stretches towards the seams, and that's just believably what fabric does. So hopefully at this point you can kind of see why we laid out UVs before the simulation and the fruits of that choice now. So let's take the weave pattern and actually make it into a believable hoodie material. I'm going to add a color mix RGB, and we'll use the weave pattern initially as an overlay where we can select a color. Now you can make this whatever you want. Shift Control click on that. If you want a blue hoodie, if we look at our reference, What are some options? We've got white, we've got this like mint green, right? So something like this. But for the overlay, keep in mind that this particular hoodie doesn't seem to have a lot of that variation. So you might want to take the overlay down to make it more subtle. There's something definitive about making that thread pattern more visible. And so you'll have to be the judge based on what type of hoodie or clothing you're going to be creating. I'm actually going to go with this one here, this kind of typical gray hoodie. Now you might be thinking, why not use this opportunity to make some flashy hoodie, bright colors, maybe put a logo on it? That's certainly something I've thought about, and I might do some alternate versions. But big picture, for this final portrait, I don't want the hoodie to steal any of the attention. I want it to be believable if you're looking at it, but I also want it to be forgettable so that we're focused on the face primarily. So a gray hoodie to me is the best choice for that reason. Also, I think the type of person that this portrait is would probably favor a muted color more than a bright color. But anyway, that's my reasons for going with the gray. So it might be a little bit boring, but I think it serves the purpose better. So we'll take the saturation down and we'll make the color darker. And we'll keep the overlay at like 0.5. I like that value, though we'll probably adjust it over time. And then this will go into the base color. Let's look at the principled BSDF, which by default has a specular value. We don't want any specular on this material. In my experience, this is one of the rare instances where we want zero reflection, primarily because sweatshirt material is very soft, and that's a key characteristic we want to capture. And specular pushes against that characteristic, so no specular. And the only other material characteristic in the principled BSDF is possibly the sheen. So I don't use this that often, and it's pretty subtle. But if we turn that off and then on, you can see that it's kind of highlighting the grazing angles of our mesh. And anytime you want to control the grazing angles, this is referred to as Fresnel. And so the sheen tries to implement that. I wonder if I can go above 1. We can. So we can go up to like 5, let's say. And this starts to soften our sweatshirt material significantly. So this Fresnel component is crucial to softening the fabric. Now, we can also use the weave pattern for a bump map. If I add a vector bump node, let's take a reroute node and plug it into the height. And if we shift control, click on that bump, it's going to be way too strong at full strength. Let's go down to like 0.2. This is where you can also dictate the type of fabric, where coarser material tends to have a stronger bump or stronger evidence of the weave, but a softer fabric has a lower bump value. So I'm going to keep it lower for the sake of softness, but you can see how that's going to affect our material pretty well. We can plug that into our normal socket, maybe bring it lower. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that's a good addition. Now, another key characteristic of this particular sweatshirt material that you don't see in all of them is an additional noise-like pattern with distinct bright spots and dark spots. We contribute a little bit to that effect with our random value, the randomness of the threads, but we actually need another component to govern that characteristic more definitively. And we're going to do that with a noise pattern. So texture, noise texture, and Control T because we do want our texture coordinates being UVs, and we will adjust the mapping node. And so this is actually pretty simple. Shift Control click on the factor. We want the scale to be much higher. Let's try 100. And that's good for now. The key thing I want to do with the mapping is kind of squash it vertically. So we'll take the Y value and increase the value. Let's try 2. All right, so this squashes it down. And this starts to look like the pattern we see in our hoodie. If we can get the scale right, let's increase the detail, of course, to 10. As is standard with highly detailed materials. You see me do that all the time. Roughness, we can also take up to like 0.8. That's going to help it feel a little bit smaller or higher frequency. I still think this scale value is too high. What about 200? I think we're in a better spot. All right, let's manipulate our color then with another overlay node or color mix node that's set to an overlay blend type. We'll reroute this into color slot 2. Shift Control click on the overlay color by itself and maybe increase the factor. Yeah, that's starting to look like our reference image. Excellent. And if we zoom in really close, we're even getting that really fibrous detail. So very much a benefit of the procedural approach compared to painting this with a texture map. By this point, even an 8K map would be pixelated. And so let's see how this looks plugged into our BSDF. Ooh, yeah, that's feeling much better, much more sweatshirt-like, or at least this sweatshirt. And let's see, I want to choose a different light probe. Let's try this forest one. But yeah, you can see that sheen doing a pretty good job, honestly, better than I expected. And I'm just about ready to render a first version. Actually, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. We'll switch to image editor and render result. Switch to slot 1, go to our camera view, and let's see how this renders. Let's see that full resolution. Where did all our sheen go? I mean, it feels okay. It's not quite as soft as I'd like, but I do like that the thread pattern in the bump is showing up a bit. It's not overly strong, but it's giving a nice texture to the fabric. And it feels sort of soft, but I feel like we lost a lot of the sheen. Let's go to rendered view and see what's so different. Maybe it's just the lighting, but I am pretty underwhelmed by the amount of sheen. And we've got that cranked up to 5. Let's see what it looks like with different lighting scenarios. All right, it's looking okay. A little more sheen there. Very little sheen there. This one I need to change to 90 degrees in Z. Yeah. You know, I don't think the sheen is going to get the job done. It's convenient that we have a simple parameter there, but I need more fine-tuned control. So let's bust out its own sheen component using a mix shader and mixing in a diffuse element. All right, so this is going to go into slot 2, which is going to be controlled by an input layer weight. This is where we specifically define that Fresnel component I was talking about. Though we're not actually going to use Fresnel, that's sort of the general term to describe this, but we're going to use the facing socket. So if we shift control click on Fresnel, this will show you how the chest, you know, when it's directly facing the camera, it's gray. But as we rotate down, the chest is facing perpendicular and it turns white. It's a more extreme effect using the facing value, so I'm going to add a converter color ramp. Let's use B-spline for the interpolation, and I'm going to drag up the black flag. All right, looking at the front, I want to strike a balance with a little bit higher contrast. We'll have to adjust it later, I'm sure. But this will be used as a factor where the diffuse BSDF that we're adding, I want it to have a higher color value derived from this color value that we're using for the principal BSDF. Let's turn off that sheen value. And you can already see that our diffuse BSDF at a value of 0.8 is doing more for the softness than the sheen was. But we don't want to just use a standard color. Let's modify our threaded version, right? So let's add a color brightness and contrast node, add a reroute and go around the principal BSDF on the southern side, shift control click, and I want this sheen to be a brighter color. So I also don't want it to be as highly contrasted. Let's take the contrast to like negative 0.5, maybe negative 0.3 instead. All right, this does sort of increase the value a little bit, but I want to take the brightness up to like, let's try 0.5. Okay, that's a little too bright. How about 0.3? Let's try this. And this will go into the color of our diffuse BSDF. There we go. Nice, soft, much more controlled version of the sheen. And let's render this into slot 2. By the way, you've probably seen me do it a lot by now, and maybe I've already said this, but I do find that switching your viewport off of rendered view can help your render previews to go faster. So I don't recommend leaving the viewport rendering while rendering a preview. Maybe I'm wrong that it goes faster, but my system doesn't seem to like it. So, all right, let's take a look. I'm liking that. It's feeling softer compared to the before. Oh, well, this is not a fair comparison, is it? Different lighting. So let's re-render with the same lighting. Okay, fair comparison. Definitely more of that sheen effect. I mean, tremendously so, even with the same lighting. So probably a little bit too much. Might need to dial it back a touch. But we are losing a bit of detail in the sheen. Oh, and I think I know why. So we'll render over this. As a BSDF, we can also use that normal data to bump the diffuse shader node. So we'll reroute it cleanly, and that should help. I think maybe the brightness can come down. Let's try 0.2 and see what this looks like. Let's take a look. And yes, I can see a bit more bump detail in the diffuse part of our material, the grazing angles. So it's looking better, but it's still not quite the high fidelity surface texture that I want. And I have an idea for how to achieve this. If we take a look at our photo reference, it's a bit hard to describe, but I think this picture is probably the best example of it. If you try to think of this section in terms of broad texture on the surface, there's a fairly universal pattern, like a noise pattern running across the entire thing. I'm not talking about these wrinkles, but like you should be able to see these little bumps and divots really in a universal pattern. If you can't see that, just wait till we add the texture and you'll see what I mean. And I think we can simply source this from the noise texture that we squashed up here and plugged into the color data. All right, so if I grab the texture coordinate and mapping node, move them off to the side, shift right click and drag to add a reroute, duplicate this noise texture. We're going to use the same texture coordinates, but we are going to make it a bit more broad. I don't want it to be quite so high frequency like this. I do want it to be squashed in the same way. I feel like that pattern is pretty apparent in this photo. It's not running vertically, but the little divots are a little bit stretched horizontally. And so I want to take the scale down to, let's say, 50. But then also the roughness value, let's take that back down to the default 0.5. I don't want it to be quite so broken up and stippled. So let's then plug this into our bump incoming data. All right, so I'll make a little bit of room here. Add a color mix RGB node. And our weave pattern goes into slot 1, and in slot 2 comes this noise pattern. And I'll shift control click on that. It's a 50-50 mix right now. You see a little bit of that secondary noise pattern, but the real test will be how it looks with the bump node. So let's take a look at that. Let's turn the mix on and off. All right, this is without the secondary noise, and this is with the secondary noise. We can maybe see it a little bit here in the interior of the hood. No, actually, I take that back. You can't really tell at all. So this is going to come down to a balance between the bump strength and the mix strength. So I know that I want the bump to be a little bit stronger for that secondary noise pattern. So let's take the strength of the bump up to 0.5. However, I liked the weave pattern at a strength of 0.2, so I can manipulate this factor in the mix to favor the secondary noise pattern if I take it up to like 0.8. This means it's an 80% mix in favor of the secondary noise and a 20% mix in favor of the weave pattern. The idea being I can increase the strength of the bump, but decrease the influence of the weave, and that's how we can balance it out. I'll probably have to go back and forth between these settings a couple more times, but that's the idea that I'm trying to achieve. So with this now set up, let's see how it looks rendered. All right, let's see how this turned out. Ooh, we definitely see more bump detail. So I guess that the threads did increase in their strength a bit, but I like it. And I also feel like our surface is broken up by that noise. Let's test it by seeing before and after. Yeah, I think we're on the right track. It's kind of tightening the sheen also. Yeah, all of it just seems to level up in terms of detail and, you know, surface texture quality. Yeah, I think this is turning out pretty well, but I want to try seeing the noise a little more definitively. And so what I'm thinking, first switch to slot 4. Yeah, why do I keep losing the image editor? But let's see. How about we try adding a converter color ramp to our noise texture? Shift Control click on that to increase the contrast. I think this will help the bump stand out a bit more. We'll switch to B-spline and then drag up and down our flags. See if we can see that effect in the bump node by itself. Oh yeah, look at that. Big difference. And that's definitely what I'm after. Okay, so, you know, what this does do is make the fabric feel older and more worn. The newer the fabric, I'm sure you would want to diminish this effect. And also 0.5 is maybe too strong. You know, I did kind of like the threads being a little more defined. Let's keep it at 0.5. Let's see how that looks. But I sort of expect to need to bump that down. But I do like these noise pattern kind of wrinkle bumpiness that we have going on in the surface. Let's see what this looks like rendered. Let's take a look. I always expect the bumpiness of that noise pattern to hit me, but maybe it being more subtle is a better thing. Alt-J, this is before and after. Okay, we can definitely feel this more. All right, you should be able to see it kind of pop into prominence. Yeah. So this is how it started and where it is now. Much softer feeling. We've got higher surface tangibility, I'll say. As in, I feel like I could touch this fabric and it would be soft. So I think this is in a really good spot. I think we've taken the material as far as we can to feeling soft, but what's really going to complete the effect is the layer of fuzz we're going to add next.